There is a person in almost every organization who never seems to raise their voice. They do not interrupt. They do not rush to fill the empty space after someone else finishes talking. They sit in rooms full of noise and urgency and opinion, and they are still. Not passive, not disengaged. Still in the way that a deep river is still, moving with enormous force beneath a surface that gives nothing away. And yet, somehow, when this person finally speaks, the room changes. Conversations that were spinning find their axis. Decisions that were circling for an hour suddenly land. People who were mid-sentence trail off, not from interruption, but from something closer to instinct. The instinct that tells you, without being told, that what is about to be said is worth hearing. That person is not the loudest in the room. They are not the most energetic. They are not performing competence. They simply understand something that the rest of the room does not. Silence is not the absence of power. Silence is where power lives. Most professionals spend their entire careers believing the opposite. They believe that visibility requires volume, that influence is built through presence, and presence is built through speech. They talk in meetings to be seen. They answer questions before they have fully thought them through, because hesitation feels like weakness, and weakness feels like exposure. They fill pauses because silence makes them anxious, and that anxiety, that small, almost imperceptible discomfort, costs them more than they will ever calculate. Think about the last time you were in a high-stakes meeting, a performance review, a salary conversation, a room where something important was being decided and you were one of the people deciding it. How much of what you said was necessary, not useful, not intelligent, necessary? This is not a comfortable question. Most people, when they sit with it honestly, arrive at the same answer. Not much, a fraction. The rest was noise generated by the need to appear valuable rather than to be valuable. A distinction that seems minor until you understand what it signals to everyone else in the room. Here is what the most effective leaders have understood, often through years of hard experience. Speech is not free. Every sentence you produce in a professional context is a data point. Every word is being processed, evaluated, filed. The people around you, colleagues, superiors, competitors, clients, are building a continuous model of who you are, how you think, how reliable your judgment is. And that model is being updated in real time every time you open your mouth. When you speak precisely, the model updates in your favor. When you speak carelessly, when you think out loud, when you over-explain, when you repeat yourself for emphasis, when you say things mainly to fill the air, the model updates against you, not dramatically, not in ways anyone would point to directly. But the accumulation is real, and over months and years it shapes how people see you in ways that are nearly impossible to reverse. There is a behavior that neuroscientists and organizational psychologists have studied extensively, and it goes by different names in different fields. In communication research, it is sometimes called verbal flooding. In leadership studies, it appears under the broader category of low executive presence. In everyday language, most people simply recognize it as someone who talks too much, but that framing undersells the actual mechanism at work. The instinct to fill silence is not a personality trait. It is a survival response. Human beings evolved in social groups where exclusion meant death, being perceived as unintelligent, as low status, as contributing nothing to the group. These were not abstract professional concerns for our ancestors. They were existential threats. And the brain, which has not been meaningfully updated since those days, still treats social silence the same way it treats physical danger. When a pause opens in a conversation and you have not yet spoken, your nervous system interprets that silence as a threat. Your heart rate rises slightly, your mind accelerates, and you speak, not because you have something worth saying, but because your brain is trying to keep you safe in a room full of people who might, in some ancient and irrational part of your mind, decide you are not worth keeping around. Understanding this mechanism does not make the instinct disappear, but it changes what the instinct means. Because once you see it clearly, once you understand that the compulsion to speak is often fear wearing the costume of contribution, you can begin to make a different choice. And that choice, practiced deliberately over time, is what separates the people who are simply present in a room from the people who shape what happens inside it. Consider a man named David, senior manager at a mid-sized firm in Chicago, intelligent, diligent, well-liked. By every conventional measure, he was on a solid professional trajectory. But in meetings, he talked, constantly and reflexively, filling every available gap with commentary, clarification, qualification. His colleagues respected him. His superiors found him competent. But no one in that organization, when asked who they trusted with the highest stakes decisions, said David's name first. It took him 3 years of stalled advancement before someone he trusted told him the truth. "You are never the loudest voice in a room," his mentor told him. "You are the most anxious one." That sentence, delivered quietly over coffee on an unremarkable Tuesday morning, changed the trajectory of David's career more than any skill he had ever learned, any credential he had ever earned, any strategy he had ever executed. Because what David eventually learned, what this entire journey is about, is that the strategic pause is not a communication technique. It is a form of mastery. And mastery, as you are about to discover, begins not with what you say, but with the moment, the precise, deliberate, powerful moment, just before you say anything at all. But before we go further into how that mastery is built, there is something else you need to understand first, something most people in your position have never fully reckoned with. The cost you're already paying, the one you cannot see on any balance sheet, in any performance review, in any feedback conversation you have ever had. It is quieter than that, and it is far more expensive. Every profession has its visible costs, the hours logged, the energy spent, the political capital burned on the wrong initiative at the wrong moment. Professionals track these things carefully, or at least they believe they do, because the ledger feels concrete, measurable, something you can point to and say, "That cost me something, and here is approximately what." But there is another ledger, one that nobody hands you when you start your career, one that does not show up in any performance framework or competency matrix or 360-degree review. And the entries in this ledger accumulate silently, invisibly, across every meeting you have ever sat in, every conversation you have ever had, every room you have ever entered and tried in some quiet and urgent way to prove yourself worthy of being in. The cost of your words, not the content of them, not whether they were accurate or inaccurate, helpful or unhelpful, well-timed or mistimed, something more fundamental than that, the sheer volume of them. There is a principle in economics called signal dilution. The core idea is straightforward. When a signal becomes too frequent, it loses its ability to convey information. Early stock market telegraphs were valuable precisely because information was scarce. The moment information became abundant, the advantage shifted to those who could filter it, not those who could generate it. The same principle operates in every professional environment you have ever worked in. Your voice, your actual spoken presence in a room, is the signal. And like every signal, its value is determined not just by its quality, but by its frequency. When you speak rarely, people lean in. When you speak constantly, people calibrate out, not consciously, not with any deliberate intention to discount you. The brain does it automatically, the same way it tunes out the hum of an air conditioning unit within minutes of entering a room. The stimulus is still there. The brain simply stops allocating attention to it. This is what most ambitious professionals never fully grasp about the environments they are working so hard to succeed in. The rooms they are sitting in are not neutral spaces where the best ideas rise naturally to the surface. They are perception environments, where the value of any given voice is shaped as much by its rarity as by its content. Ask yourself honestly, have you ever been in a meeting where someone talked so frequently, so readily, that you stopped really hearing them? Where their contributions arrived so reliably that your brain essentially stopped processing them as meaningful input and filed them instead under background noise? Now ask yourself the harder question. Have you ever been that person? There's a woman named Claire, partner track attorney at a firm in Toronto, exceptionally sharp. The kind of legal mind that could dismantle an argument in 3 sentences and reconstruct something better in 4. Her colleagues knew this. Her superiors knew this. And yet, year after year, when partnership conversations happened, something kept her just outside the room where those decisions were made. The feedback she received was always some variation of the same thing, delivered in the careful, hedged language of professional diplomacy. Something about presence, something about gravitas, something about the way she came across in high-stakes settings. It took Claire a long time to decode what that actually meant, because the feedback was never specific enough to act on. But eventually, she found her way to a communication coach who said something that cut through all of it in a single observation. "You are demonstrating your intelligence," he told her, rather than embodying it. Demonstration requires volume. It requires output. It requires you to produce continuously and visibly so that the people around you can see the machinery working. And demonstration has its place, early in a career, in unfamiliar rooms, when trust has not yet been established and credibility must be built from scratch. But there comes a point in every professional trajectory where demonstration stops building status and starts eroding it, where the people in the room no longer need to see the machinery, where what they are now evaluating is not whether you can think, but how you think. Not whether you have ideas, but which ideas you choose to surface and when, and in what precise and considered form. That shift from demonstration to embodiment is one of the most important transitions a professional will ever navigate. And the majority of intelligent, capable people miss it entirely. Not because they are not smart enough to make the transition, but because no one ever names it for them clearly enough. Over-explaining is the most common form it takes. You have felt this, you have watched yourself do it, you make a point, a good point, a clear point, and then something in you does not trust it to land on its own, so you add a sentence, and then another sentence to support the first additional sentence, and then a qualification, because you want to be precise, you want to be fair, you want to demonstrate that you have considered multiple angles. And by the time you stop talking, the original point, the good, clear point you made 3 minutes ago, has been buried under the weight of everything you added to protect it. The irony is precise and almost painful. The very behavior that feels like thoroughness, like rigor, like intellectual honesty, is the behavior that is quietly dismantling the authority you are trying to establish. Because here is what the room hears when you over-explain. Not precision, not depth. What the room hears, at the level below conscious thought, is uncertainty. The brain of the person listening to you is running a constant background process that evaluates not just what you are saying, but why you are saying it. And when you keep adding, keep qualifying, keep reaching for one more supporting sentence, that background process generates a quiet verdict. This person does not trust their own thinking. And if you do not trust your own thinking, the room has very little reason to trust it either. This is the cost that does not appear on any ledger. Not charged once, not charged dramatically, but deducted in tiny invisible increments across every professional interaction you have, accumulating across quarters and years into something that eventually has a name, a ceiling. But here is what almost nobody realizes about this ceiling, and it is the thing that changes everything once you understand it. It is not structural. It was never fixed in place by anyone else's decision about your worth or your potential. It is self-installed, built word by careful, anxious word, sentence by protective qualifying sentence, out of the same intelligence and diligence that should have been your greatest asset, which means it can come down. And the first tool you will need to bring it down has nothing to do with what you say. It has everything to do with what happens inside your brain in the half second before you say anything at all, a half second that science has spent decades studying, and that the most effective communicators in the world have spent lifetimes learning to inhabit. There is a moment that every experienced surgeon knows. It arrives not in the operating room, not under lights with instruments in hand, but in the corridor just before. A stillness that the best of them cultivate deliberately, almost ritualistically. A conscious deceleration before the threshold, not because they are uncertain, not because they need more time to prepare, but because they have learned through years of high-stakes practice that the quality of what happens inside the room is shaped by the quality of the mind that walks into it. What surgeons know about the pre-performance moment, the most effective communicators know about the pre-speech moment. And neuroscience, over the last 3 decades, has been quietly catching up with what both groups already understood intuitively. When you speak, you're not simply transmitting information. You are triggering a cascade of neurological evaluations in the brain of every person listening to you. These evaluations happen below the level of conscious thought, faster than language, faster than logic. They happen in structures of the brain that evolved hundreds of thousands of years before abstract reasoning existed, and they answer a set of questions that have remained essentially unchanged since human beings first formed social groups. Is this person worth listening to? Does this person know something I do not? Should I update my thinking based on what this person is saying? These questions are not answered by the content of your words. They are answered by signals, patterns in your delivery, your timing, your physical stillness, the rhythm of your sentences, and above all, the quality of the silence that exists around what you say. The brain assigns credibility through a process researchers call neural entrainment. When one person speaks with calm, measured authority, the brains of the people listening begin to synchronize with the speaker's rhythm. This is not a metaphor, it is a documented neurological phenomenon. EEG studies have shown that audiences literally fall into step with a speaker's pacing. their neural oscillations aligning with the speaker's vocal rhythm in ways that increase comprehension, retention, and crucially, perceived trustworthiness. The speaker sets the pace. The room follows. But here is what makes this finding so striking in its implications for professional environments. The synchronization effect is strongest not during the densest, most information-rich parts of a speaker's delivery. It is strongest during the pauses. The pauses are where the brain of the listener catches up, consolidates, assigns meaning. The pauses are where comprehension deepens from surface processing into something more durable. And when a speaker removes those pauses, when they speak in the continuous, unbroken stream that anxiety and urgency tend to produce, the listener's brain cannot complete that consolidation process. Information moves through without fully landing. It is heard without being absorbed, understood in the moment and forgotten within minutes. This is why the most technically brilliant presentation you have ever witnessed sometimes left you feeling curiously empty afterward, and why a far simpler talk, delivered with stillness and space and unhurried precision, stayed with you for weeks. The content was not the variable, the architecture of the silence was. Consider a man named Marcus, head of strategy at a financial services firm in London. Highly analytical, deeply read, the kind of person whose preparation for any presentation was so thorough it bordered on exhaustive. He knew his material at a level that most of his colleagues could not match. And yet, in rooms with senior leadership, something consistently failed to transfer. His ideas landed softly when they should have landed with weight. His recommendations were heard, but rarely adopted with urgency. His presentations were respected in the way that a dense technical report is respected, acknowledged, filed, not acted upon. A communication consultant who worked with his firm gave Marcus a piece of feedback that initially baffled him. She told him that he was speaking too fast, but not in the way he assumed she meant. It was not about the words per minute. It was about the relationship between his sentences. Each idea was arriving before the previous one had been given room to exist. He was, she told him, presenting his thinking rather than sharing it. The distinction sounds subtle. It is not subtle at all. Presenting thinking is a performance directed outward. It is the mind trying to demonstrate its own contents as quickly and completely as possible, driven by the fear that if the full picture is not transmitted immediately, something essential will be lost or dismissed. It produces the verbal equivalent of a data dump, technically complete, experientially overwhelming. Sharing thinking is something different. It is the act of inviting another mind into a process rather than delivering a finished product to it. It moves more slowly. It leaves room. It trusts the listener to be an active participant rather than a passive recipient. And that trust, that implicit respect for the listener's intelligence and attention, is itself a form of authority. When you share rather than present, you are communicating something at a level below the content of your words. You're communicating that you're not afraid of the space between your ideas, that you do not need every moment filled, that your thinking is solid enough to withstand silence and you know it. That signal is extraordinarily powerful, and it is entirely independent of what you're actually saying. This is the counterintuitive truth that takes most professionals years to fully absorb. You do not earn the room's deep attention by giving them more to process. You earn it by giving them less, delivered with such precision and such stillness that what little you do offer feels to the listening brain like the most important thing said all day. Marcus eventually learned this, not overnight and not without significant discomfort, because slowing down in a high-stakes room felt initially like vulnerability, like exposure, like arriving at a meeting with fewer weapons than everyone else. What he discovered, after practicing the pause with the same rigor he had always applied to his content preparation, was something that reversed every assumption he had built his professional identity around. The room did not see his stillness as vulnerability. They saw it as the one thing that is rarer in most professional environments than talent or knowledge or even experience. They saw it as certainty. And certainty, as it turns out, is one of the most contagious states one human mind can transmit to another. But the way it travels, the precise mechanism through which one person's internal state reshapes an entire room, is something most people have completely backwards. What comes next changes how most people think about influence entirely. There's a negotiation tactic so effective, so consistently documented across decades of research, that the world's most experienced dealmakers treat it less like a technique and more like a law of nature. It has no formal name in most boardrooms. It is not taught in the majority of MBA programs. It does not appear on any list of communication competencies that HR departments use to evaluate rising talent. And yet the professionals who have mastered it, in courtrooms and acquisition talks and salary conversations, in the quiet rooms where the real decisions get made, describe it in almost identical terms regardless of their industry or background. They describe it as the most powerful thing they never say. Strategic listening, not the performative kind, where you nod at appropriate intervals and wait for your turn to speak, not the empathetic kind, where the goal is to make the other person feel heard so they lower their guard. Something more precise than either of those, something that operates at the level of architecture rather than manner, that shapes the entire structure of an interaction rather than simply improving its texture. The distinction matters enormously, and it begins with understanding what most people are actually doing when they believe they are listening. In the early 1970s, a psychologist named Ralph Nichols conducted a series of studies on listening behavior in professional environments. And what he found was striking in its consistency. The average professional, when engaged in conversation, spends approximately 70% of their apparent listening time not processing what the other person is saying, but preparing their own response to it. They are not present in the conversation. They are rehearsing for their next entry into it. The implications of this are significant, and they run in two directions simultaneously. The first implication is about information. When you're rehearsing your response rather than genuinely processing what is being said, you are operating on an incomplete picture of the other person's actual position. You're responding to the first version of their thinking, the surface layer, and while the deeper, more revealing layer passes through unheard. Negotiators who operate this way consistently leave value on the table, not because they lack the skill to capture it, but because they never received the information that would have shown them where it was. The second implication is about power, and this one is less obvious but ultimately more consequential. When you are visibly present, genuinely, completely attending to another person rather than cycling through your own internal preparation, something happens to that person's behavior that they are almost never aware of. They talk more. They go deeper. They begin, gradually and without realizing it, to reveal more than they intended to reveal. Not because they have been manipulated into disclosure, but because sustained, genuine attention is so rare in most professional interactions that when people encounter it, something in them responds to it like a plant turning toward light. Think about that for a moment. The simple act of truly listening, of being so completely present that the other person can feel your full attention, causes them to give you more information than they would have given a less attentive listener. And information in any high-stakes professional context is not just useful. Information is the entire game. There's a woman named Sandra, senior vice president at a technology company in Seattle, known throughout her organization as someone extraordinarily effective in negotiations, with vendors, with clients, with internal stakeholders pushing competing agendas. Her colleagues had noticed something consistent about the way she operated in these conversations, but most of them could not name it precisely. She seemed, in some difficult-to-articulate way, to always know more than anyone else in the room, to always have access to a piece of the picture that others had missed. What Sandra understood, and had understood since early in her career, was that most people enter a negotiation focused on what they are going to say. She entered every negotiation focused on what the other person was going to reveal, not what they were going to say, what they were going to reveal. The difference is not semantic. What people say is deliberate, prepared, strategic. What they reveal is what escapes in the gaps, in the qualifications they did not plan to include, in the questions they ask that expose their anxieties, in the details they linger on longer than the content warrants, in the pauses they take before answering certain questions and not others. Sandra listened for the gaps, and because she was quiet enough, still enough, present enough to actually hear them, she consistently walked out of rooms knowing things about the other party's position that they had never consciously intended to share. This is strategic listening in its most developed form. It is not a passive activity. It is one of the most cognitively demanding things a professional can do, requiring the complete suppression of the self-referential mental chatter that most people mistake for active engagement. It requires, above all, a willingness to be comfortable with silence, because silence is where the revealing happens. The person who can sit with a pause after someone else has finished speaking, who does not rush to fill it, who waits, who simply remains present and attentive, will consistently receive more than the person who speaks the moment a gap appears. In hostage negotiation, this principle is so well established that it functions as foundational doctrine. FBI negotiators are trained to ask a question and then do something that feels almost physically uncomfortable the first time you practice it. They are trained to stop, to wait, to allow the silence after their question to extend well beyond what social convention would normally permit. Because they know, from decades of field data and psychological research, that the person on the other side of that silence will almost always fill it. And what they use to fill it tells the negotiator everything. The same dynamic operates in every professional conversation you will ever have. The colleague who fills a silence with a concession they did not need to make. The client who answers a question you did not ask because the pause made them feel the need to justify themselves. The superior who reveals the real constraint behind a decision because you stayed quiet long enough for the official explanation to feel insufficient, even to them. But strategic listening builds something beyond information. Something slower, less transactional, and ultimately far more valuable. It builds the rarest currency in any professional ecosystem, a currency that cannot be spent quickly and cannot be faked for long. It builds loyalty, because people do not follow the loudest voice in the room. They do not give their deepest commitment to the most articulate or the most persuasive or the most impressively credentialed. Over time, with great consistency, people give their loyalty to the person who made them feel, in a world full of noise and distraction and performative attention, genuinely and completely heard. And the professionals who understand this, who have built their influence not through the volume of their output, but through the quality of their presence, carry with them something that their more vocal counterparts are always, in some quiet part of themselves, searching for. They carry rooms with them wherever they go. But collecting information and building loyalty, as powerful as both are, represent only part of what strategic silence makes possible. Because there is a third dimension to this, one that operates not in the listening, but in the precise, calibrated, almost surgical moment just before you finally choose to speak. There's a question that separates two entirely different categories of professional communicator, and most people have never been asked it directly. When you are about to speak, in a meeting, in a negotiation, in a conversation where something real is at stake, what are you responding to? Not what are you saying, what are you responding to? Because there are only two possible answers, and which one is true for you in any given moment determines, more than your vocabulary, more than your preparation, more than your years of accumulated expertise, how the room receives what comes out of your mouth. The first answer is, you're responding to the moment as it actually is, to what was genuinely just said, what was meant beneath what was said, what the room needs right now, what the conversation is actually asking for. The second answer is, you are responding to your own internal state, to the anxiety that the silence triggered, to the need to demonstrate that you are paying attention, to the fear that if you do not speak now, the moment will close and you will have lost something. Influence, relevance, the impression of being engaged. The first response produces communication that lands. The second produces communication that fills space. And the difference between them is located entirely in a window of time so brief that most people do not even know it exists. A window measured not in seconds, but in fractions of seconds. The gap between stimulus and response. The pause before the pause. The moment, invisible to everyone else in the room, but entirely available to you, where something is either chosen or simply allowed to happen. Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps and went on to found an entire school of psychotherapy, wrote one of the most quietly revolutionary sentences in the history of behavioral science. He wrote that between stimulus and response there is a space, and in that space lies our freedom and our growth. Frankl was writing about suffering and meaning, but the principle he identified operates with equal force in every boardroom, every negotiation, every professional conversation, where something real is being decided. The space is where the choice lives. Most professionals have never been taught to inhabit that space deliberately. They have been taught content, what to say, how to structure an argument, how to present data compellingly, how to handle objections. They have rarely, if ever, been taught the one thing that determines how effectively all of that content is received, how to enter the space before they speak, and how to use it. Consider what happens in the brain during that fraction of a second between hearing something and responding to it. The amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, processes incoming stimuli approximately 250 milliseconds before the prefrontal cortex, the seat of reasoning and judgment, receives the same information. This means that for a quarter of a second after anything happens in a conversation, your brain's emotional response is already in motion before your thinking brain has even entered the picture. For the majority of professional communicators, that quarter-second window is where the damage happens. The reactive answer, the defensive qualification. The statement made, not from clarity, but from the emotional charge of a challenge or a silence or a question that felt in that first amygdala-processed instant like a threat. The considered response, the response that people remember, that changes the direction of a conversation, that makes a room lean forward rather than settle back, comes from the professionals who have learned to extend that window, not by suppressing the emotional response, which is neither possible nor useful, but by building a practiced habit of non-immediacy, a deliberate, almost meditative discipline of not yet. There's a man named James, general counsel at a healthcare company in Boston. In his early career, he was known as a fast thinker, someone who could process information quickly and respond with impressive speed. His superiors valued this. His colleagues found it slightly exhausting. And James himself, by his early 40s, had begun to notice something that troubled him. His fastest responses were rarely his best ones. The answers he was most proud of, the reframes that shifted an entire negotiation, the observations that cut through 3 hours of circular discussion to the actual question underneath, almost never came from speed. They came from the moments when something made him pause, when he did not know quite what to say, and instead of manufacturing an immediate response, he simply waited, breathed, let the question sit in him for a moment longer than was comfortable, and found, in that additional moment, something more true than what speed would have produced. He began to practice this deliberately, not as a trick or a technique, but as a genuine discipline, the way a musician practices scales, not to perform scales, but to develop the underlying capacity that scales train. He would sit with questions before answering them. He would let silence open in meetings without rushing to close it. He would notice the pull toward immediacy and, rather than following it, simply observe it. And what he discovered over the course of a year of this practice surprised him with its simplicity. The room did not experience his pauses as hesitation. They experienced them as consideration. And consideration, it turned out, was something so rare in the fast-moving, always-on professional environments most people inhabit that, when they encountered it, they responded with something that James had spent his entire career trying to earn through speed and output and relentless preparation. They responded with trust. Trust is not built in the content of what you say. It is built in the evidence that you thought before you spoke, that you respected the question enough to sit with it, that you valued accuracy over immediacy, and truth over the impression of confidence that speed creates. This is the considered response in practice, not slower thinking. James was quick to make this distinction when he talked about it with younger colleagues. The thinking can be exactly as fast as it always was. What changes is the relationship between the completion of the thought and the opening of the mouth, a relationship that most people treat as automatic, as a direct and immediate connection, when in reality it is a choice available in every single professional interaction, every single time, to anyone willing to practice making it. The art of the considered response does not make you seem uncertain. It does not make you seem slow. It makes you seem like the rarest thing in most professional rooms, the person who is not reacting to the conversation, but shaping it. And when you combine that capacity with what comes next, the specific high-stakes situations where silence does not merely enhance your communication, but actively and measurably determines the outcome, you begin to understand why the most effective leaders have always spoken less, and why, without exception, they have always earned more. There's a number that exists in almost every salary negotiation, and only one person in the room knows what it is. It is not the number being discussed. It is not the offer on the table or the counteroffer being prepared or the figure that either party has described as their position. It is a different number entirely, a private number, the number below which the person making the offer will not go and above which the person receiving it dares not ask. The entire negotiation, every word spoken, every justification offered, every strategic retreat and carefully worded concession is a performance staged around that number, and the person who walks out of the room closest to it is almost never the most prepared, the most articulate, or the most assertive. It is almost always the person who spoke last. This is not folk wisdom. It is one of the most consistently replicated findings in negotiation research, documented across cultures, industries, and stakes levels, ranging from used car transactions to nine-figure corporate acquisitions. The first person to name a number anchors the conversation. The first person to justify their position in detail exposes their constraints. The first person to fill a silence, the silence that opens after an offer has been made and hangs in the air waiting for a response, is the first person to begin negotiating against themselves. The silence after an offer is perhaps the single most valuable piece of real estate in any high-stakes professional conversation, and the vast majority of people give it away for free within 3 seconds of it opening. Think about what happens in that silence from the perspective of the person who made the offer. They have committed to a position, they have put something on the table, and now they are watching you process it, reading every micro-expression, every shift in posture, every flicker of reaction across your face. Their brain, running the same ancient threat detection software that everyone carries, is generating a continuous stream of interpretation. And what it is most acutely sensitive to, in those first few seconds of silence, is any signal that their offer was insufficient. If you speak immediately, if you respond with enthusiasm or with a counter that arrives too quickly, you have just told them, without using a single word, that their opening position was stronger than they needed it to be. But if you are still, if you receive the offer with a calm, unhurried, unreadable quality of attention, if you allow the silence to breathe for 5 seconds, 10 seconds, longer than either of you is comfortable with, something shifts in the room that no amount of verbal negotiating skill can manufacture. Doubt begins to move in the other direction. Their brain starts questioning their own number. Chris Voss, the former FBI lead hostage negotiator who spent decades in situations where the stakes of a conversation were measured in human lives, has written and spoken extensively about the power of silence in high-stakes exchanges. What he observed across hundreds of negotiations was a pattern so consistent it had the quality of a physical law. The party that maintained the most comfort with silence consistently extracted the most value from the exchange, not because silence is inherently persuasive, but because discomfort with silence almost always produces premature disclosure. And premature disclosure, in any negotiation, is the beginning of the end of your leverage. There's a woman named Rachel, marketing director at a consumer goods company in Atlanta. When she was offered a senior vice president role at a competing firm, she did something in the negotiation conversation that she had never done before, largely because a mentor had told her about it the week prior, and she had decided, with some trepidation, to try it. The offer came. A specific number, a specific package delivered by the hiring executive with the kind of confident framing that implied it was generous and final. Rachel said nothing. Not nothing as a tactic, nothing as a genuine considered response to a moment that deserved more than an immediate reaction. She looked at the executive across the table. She let the number sit in the room. She breathed. She gave herself the space to actually receive what had been said rather than reflexively responding to it. 4 seconds passed. 5. 6. The executive spoke. He told her that there might be some flexibility on the base, and that he wanted to make sure the package was competitive with whatever she was currently earning. He mentioned a signing bonus that had not been part of the original offer. He said that he really wanted this to work. Rachel had not said a single word. She had not countered, not pushed back, not deployed a single negotiating technique from any book or training program. She had simply been still. And in that stillness, in those 6 seconds of silence that felt to her like 6 minutes, the other side of the table had done her negotiating for her. She walked out of that conversation with a package 17% higher than the initial offer. Not because of what she said, because of what she did not say and when she did not say it. This dynamic extends far beyond salary conversations. It operates in performance reviews, where the executive who waits after delivering feedback receives far more honest self-assessment from the recipient than the one who fills the space with additional commentary. It operates in client conversations, where the consultant who resists the urge to immediately justify a proposal after presenting it gives the client's genuine concerns room to surface, which is far more useful than a polished defense of a position the client has not yet had the chance to actually question. It operates in board presentations, in partnership discussions, in the quiet, consequential conversations between a leader and a team member where what is not said in the first 30 seconds determines everything about what gets said in the next 30 minutes. The pattern is consistent enough and documented thoroughly enough to support a principle that sounds almost too simple to take seriously until you have watched it work in a room where something real was on the line. In any high-stakes conversation, the person most willing to be silent holds the most power. Not the most knowledge, not the best preparation, not the strongest position, the most willingness to be silent. But silence in negotiation, as powerful as it is, operates over minutes. What comes next operates over something longer. Something that builds not in a single conversation, but across months and years of consistent presence in rooms where people are watching. Not just what you say, but what you are. And what you are, it turns out, has almost nothing to do with how much you speak. There's a particular kind of person who changes the atmosphere of a room simply by entering it, not through announcement, not through the force of their personality arriving ahead of them like weather, not through any visible effort or performance of significance. They simply cross the threshold, find their place, and something in the room, some quality of the collective attention, quietly orients toward them the way compass needles orient toward north. You have encountered this person, perhaps in a boardroom, perhaps at a professional gathering, perhaps in a meeting where they sat at the periphery of the conversation for long stretches, and yet somehow remained its gravitational center. You may have tried to identify what produced the effect and found the analysis frustratingly incomplete. They were not the best dressed, not the most formally credentialed, not the most obviously powerful by title or organizational rank. They were simply, in some quality that resisted easy description, more present than everyone else in the room. Presence is the most coveted and least understood professional asset that exists. Leadership consultants charge significant sums to help executives develop it. Business schools teach adjacent concepts, executive presence, gravitas, authority, in courses that produce varying results. And the frustrating reality, which most of these programs eventually arrive at without fully resolving, is that presence cannot be installed through technique. It can only be grown through a particular relationship with attention. The people who possess genuine presence, the kind that persists across contexts, that works in a boardroom and a corridor conversation and an unexpected encounter in an elevator, share a quality that is deceptively simple to describe and genuinely difficult to practice. They are more interested in what is happening than in how they are appearing. This distinction sounds almost philosophical until you begin to observe it in practice, at which point it becomes one of the most practically useful lenses you will ever apply to professional behavior. Because the difference between these two orientations, toward what is happening versus toward how you are appearing, produces entirely different behavioral profiles. And those behavioral profiles are legible to every person in the room, at a level below conscious thought, within minutes of any interaction beginning. The person oriented toward appearance is managing a continuous internal performance review. They are monitoring how their contributions are landing, adjusting their posture, calibrating their expressions, tracking who in the room is watching them and who is not. They speak when they calculate that speaking will improve their position. They listen in the partial, distracted way of someone whose attention is divided between the conversation and their own self-assessment of how they are doing in it. The person oriented toward what is happening is doing none of this. They are simply there, attending, processing, receiving. Their attention is external rather than self-referential, directed outward with a quality of genuine curiosity that the room registers as interest, as respect, as the particular kind of dignity that comes from treating the present moment as worthy of full attention. And the paradox, the deep counterintuitive paradox that takes most people years to fully absorb, is that the person oriented toward appearance almost never achieves the presence they are performing toward, while the person who has stopped performing presence entirely, who has redirected all of that self-monitoring energy outward into genuine engagement, produces the very effect the first person is working so hard to manufacture. Think about that for a moment. The pursuit of presence kills presence. The abandonment of the pursuit creates it. There's a woman named Elena, Chief Operating Officer at a manufacturing group in Manchester. Before she reached that role, she spent several years in what she later described as a performance trap, a state of continuous, exhausting self-management in professional settings that produced acceptable results and left her feeling, at the end of every significant interaction, hollowed out and faintly fraudulent. A coach she worked with gave her a single instruction that she initially dismissed as too simple to be useful. For the next 30 days, in every professional conversation, she was to make her only internal objective the following: understand what the other person actually thinks, not what they are saying. What they actually think, not influence them, not impress them, not manage how she appeared to them. Simply understand what was genuinely present in their mind behind the professional language they were using to express it. The instruction worked not because it was a technique for producing presence, but because it was a technique for redirecting attention. It gave Elena's self-monitoring mind something external to focus on, something genuinely interesting, genuinely challenging, genuinely worthy of the cognitive energy she had been spending on self-assessment. And the moment her attention moved outward, the performance trap dissolved. Not because she had solved it, but because she had stopped feeding it. The behavioral changes that followed were ones she had not anticipated. She found herself speaking less, not as a strategy, but as a natural consequence of being more interested in listening than in contributing. She found her contributions, when they did come, arriving with a precision and relevance that her previous approach had rarely produced. She found people lingering after meetings to continue conversations with her. She found herself being consulted on matters outside her formal domain by people who had simply noticed, without being able to articulate exactly why, that talking to Elena was different from talking to most people. It felt like being actually heard. This is the economy of expression in its fullest form. Not strategic silence deployed as a negotiating tool, not the considered pause practiced as a communication technique, but something more fundamental than either. A settled relationship with attention itself. The quiet confidence of a person who does not need to fill the air to justify their presence in a room, because their presence does not depend on the air they fill. The most compelling people in any professional environment are almost never the most vocal. They are the most attentive, and their attentiveness creates around them a quality of social gravity, a pull that draws people toward them, not out of obligation or a hierarchy, but out of something closer to genuine desire. The desire to be in the presence of someone who makes the world feel, briefly and valuably, more coherent. That quality cannot be performed into existence. It cannot be scheduled or systematized or optimized through a framework. It grows from a single, sustainable, quietly radical practice, caring more about what is real than about how you appear. And yet, even this, even the genuine cultivation of presence through redirected attention, runs into a wall that most people hit long before they reach the level of influence they are capable of, a wall that is not external, that was not built by anyone else, that exists with remarkable specificity at the intersection of identity and belief. Because changing how you communicate is one thing. Changing who you believe yourself to be as a communicator is something else entirely. And until that deeper change happens, every technique, every practice, every hard-won insight tends to erode under the pressure of the identity it is trying to override. There is a story most ambitious people carry about themselves as communicators, and it was written so early and revised so rarely that most of them have stopped noticing. It is a story at all. It arrived in pieces. A teacher who rewarded the students who spoke most confidently in class. A family dinner table where volume determined whose idea got heard. A first job where the colleague who dominated every meeting got promoted ahead of the colleague who thought more carefully and spoke more rarely. A culture, professional, social, generational, that consistently and visibly rewarded the people who took up the most space with their voices, and filed the quieter ones under the category of people who perhaps had less to say. And somewhere in the accumulation of all of that, a belief calcified, not chosen, not examined, not arrived at through any deliberate process of reflection, simply absorbed the way children absorb the rules of the world they are raised in, because the alternative, deciding that the world might be wrong, requires a kind of cognitive courage that is genuinely difficult to access when you're 12 years old and trying to figure out where you fit. The belief sounds like this in its most common form. Visible people speak, valuable people are heard. And the way you become visible, the way you ensure you're heard, is by occupying the available space with your voice before someone else occupies it first. This belief is so widely shared, so culturally reinforced, so embedded in the behavioral norms of most professional environments, that questioning it feels less like updating a perspective and more like defecting from a consensus reality. And that feeling, that subtle social vertigo of moving against a current that almost everyone around you is swimming with, is precisely why so many intelligent professionals, people who have absorbed everything in the previous sections of this journey with genuine recognition and genuine intention, still find themselves reverting to old patterns the moment they walk into a room where something real is at stake. It is not a failure of technique. It is a failure of identity. And identity failures cannot be solved with better techniques. The psychologist Carol Dweck spent decades studying how human beings relate to their own capabilities, how they understand the nature of their intelligence, their talent, their potential for change. Her research produced a body of findings that are by now well known in educational and organizational contexts. But there is one dimension of her work that receives less attention than it deserves, and it is the dimension most directly relevant to what we are examining here. Dweck found that people do not just hold beliefs about their capabilities. They hold beliefs about the kind of person they are, and the kind of person they believe they are functions as a powerful gravitational field that pulls their behavior back toward its center, regardless of what they consciously intend to do differently. If you believe at the identity level that you are someone who contributes through volume, someone whose value is demonstrated through active, visible, frequent participation, then every moment of deliberate silence will feel like a betrayal of yourself, not a technique you have not yet mastered, a fundamental contradiction of who you are. And that feeling, generated not by the external world, but by the internal architecture of your self-concept, will reliably erode your best intentions within minutes of any high-stakes conversation beginning. This is why the people who make the deepest, most durable changes in their communication patterns are never the ones who simply practice new behaviors. They are the ones who first change the story they tell about what those behaviors mean. There is a man named Daniel, regional director at a logistics company in Vancouver, attended a leadership development program in his mid-30s that included a significant component on executive communication, came back with notebooks full of frameworks, practiced the techniques diligently for approximately 3 weeks, produced some results that felt genuine, and then gradually, almost imperceptibly, drifted back to exactly the patterns he had arrived with. His coach, in a follow-up session 6 months later, asked him a question that Daniel later described as the most uncomfortable professional question he had ever been asked. She asked him, "What do you think it means about you when you're silent in a room?" Daniel sat with that question for a long time before answering, and what he eventually said, with the careful honesty of someone who has decided that the comfortable answer is no longer worth the cost, was this: "It means I am not contributing. It means I might be invisible. It means someone might wonder why I am in the room." His coach did not tell him he was wrong. She did not offer a reframe or a counterargument or more adaptive interpretation to replace the one he had just surfaced. She simply asked him to consider where that meaning had come from, not as an intellectual exercise, as a genuine archaeological inquiry into the origins of a belief that was running his behavior from a depth he had never previously examined. What Daniel found, when he looked, was that the belief had been formed in a specific context, a specific time, a specific environment, a specific set of social rules that bore almost no resemblance to the professional reality he now inhabited. The room, where silence had genuinely meant invisibility, was a classroom 30 years ago. The person for whom contribution required constant audible output was a child trying to establish relevance in a world where children are evaluated on participation. He was not that child. This was not that room. But his nervous system had never received the update. The process of updating it is not quick, and it is not comfortable. And anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you a version of change that does not survive contact with a real high-stakes room. What it requires is something more demanding than practice and more intimate than technique. It requires a sustained, honest, occasionally uncomfortable examination of the story you have been telling yourself about what your silence means, and a deliberate, repeated, patient decision to assign it a different meaning. Not the meaning that feels most natural, the meaning that is most true. Because the truth is that in most professional rooms, at most career stages, silence does not signal invisibility. It signals something that the anxious, volume-oriented version of yourself has been working your entire career to project, and finding in every quarterly performance cycle that volume alone cannot deliver. It signals that you are someone who does not need to prove themselves by filling the air. And the people in that room, the ones whose respect you actually want, whose judgment actually shapes what happens to your career, know exactly what that means. They have been watching for it. The identity shift, when it comes, does not arrive as a dramatic revelation. It arrives quietly. In a meeting where you choose not to speak and find, to your genuine surprise, that the room does not contract around your silence but expands into it. In a conversation where you ask one question instead of making 4 points and watch the other person give you everything you needed to know. In a performance review where you receive feedback you had never heard before because you were finally still enough to let it reach you. These small moments accumulate. And what they accumulate into is not just a new set of communication habits. It is a new understanding of what you are capable of and what you have always been capable of in rooms where the most important things are decided. But identity, as foundational as it is, only tells half the story of what sustained communicative restraint actually builds, because the other half does not live in a single room or a single conversation or even a single year. It lives in the long, patient, compounding arc of a reputation that arrives somewhere most people are always rushing toward and never quite reaching. Reputation is the only professional asset that cannot be acquired quickly. Every other advantage can be compressed. Knowledge can be accelerated through focused study. Skills can be developed through deliberate practice. Networks can be built through strategic effort. Even credibility, in the short term, can be manufactured through the careful management of appearances. But reputation, genuine, durable, the kind that precedes you into rooms you have not yet entered and speaks on your behalf in conversations you are not present for, operates on a timeline that refuses to be hurried. It is built in increments so small they are invisible in any individual moment. And it is built, more than most people realize, not from what you have done, but from what you consistently are. Not from your greatest achievements or your most impressive performances, but from the steady, accumulated evidence of how you show up across thousands of ordinary interactions that no one was particularly watching, and no one was particularly evaluating, and no one, at the time, would have described as significant. The way you handled a meeting that ran over time, the way you responded to an idea you disagreed with, the way you occupied a room when you had no formal reason to assert yourself, the way you listened when listening was all that was required, the way you were silent when silence was the most intelligent available response. These moments are the material of reputation, not the highlights, the texture. And the professionals who build the most enduring reputations, the ones whose influence outlasts their formal authority, whose judgment is sought long after their title would conventionally justify it, share a quality in their texture that is consistent enough to constitute a pattern. They are the same person in every room. Not the same content. They adapt their communication to context with the fluency of any skilled professional, but the same quality of presence, the same relationship with silence, the same unhurried, unperformative attentiveness that produces, over time and across contexts, the thing that all the volume in the world cannot manufacture. Trust at scale. There is a concept in behavioral economics called the consistency heuristic. The human brain, when evaluating the reliability of another person, does not primarily assess the quality of their best moments. It assesses the predictability of their behavior across a range of situations, particularly situations where that behavior was not required or rewarded. Because consistent behavior in uncelebrated moments is the only evidence that the behavior is genuine rather than performed. When you are the same communicator in a hallway conversation as you are in a board presentation, when your stillness and your precision and your relationship with silence do not vary based on who is watching, you are producing evidence of a kind that the human brain finds deeply compelling and exceptionally rare. You are producing evidence that you are not managing an impression. You are simply being yourself. And being simply yourself in a professional world saturated with impression management is one of the most disarming and powerful things a person can do. Consider a woman named Margaret, senior partner at a consulting firm in Edinburgh. Over the course of a 30-year career, she had built a reputation that had a specific, observable texture to it, one that her colleagues and clients struggled to articulate precisely but recognized immediately. People described interactions with her using words that clustered around the same territory: measured, considered, present, trustworthy, in a way that felt different from the institutional trustworthiness of credentials and track record. More personal, more felt, more difficult to explain. What Margaret had built, without ever treating it as a construction project, was a reputation for the quality of her attention. Not her analysis, though her analysis was excellent. Not her strategy, though her strategic thinking had produced significant results for every organization she had worked with. Her attention. The consistent, unmistakable evidence delivered across 30 years of professional interactions, large and small, that when Margaret was in a conversation, she was entirely in that conversation. She was not thinking about the next meeting. She was not monitoring her own performance. She was not calculating how the current exchange mapped onto her longer-term positioning. She was present. Completely, unhurriedly, genuinely present. And that presence, that quality of attention given freely and without agenda, had compounded across decades into something that functioned in her professional life the way a deep aquifer functions beneath dry land. Invisible, inexhaustible, the source of everything that grew above it. This is the long game of earned influence, and it operates on a logic that runs directly counter to the urgency most ambitious professionals feel early in their careers. The urgency to be noticed, to be recognized, to move quickly enough that the trajectory is visible to the people who make decisions about where talent gets allocated and what opportunities get offered. That urgency is not irrational. In the early stages of a career, visibility does matter. Contribution does need to be demonstrated. The case for your value does need to be made, at least partially, through output that others can observe and evaluate. There is a season for volume, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. But the season ends earlier than most people think. And the professionals who do not notice when it ends, who carry the communication posture of a junior employee trying to establish relevance into the mid and senior stages of a career, where what is now being evaluated is judgment rather than activity, pay a cost that compounds just as surely as the benefit compounds for those who make the transition at the right moment. The cost is a reputation for noise, not incompetence, not failure, something subtler and in some ways more limiting. The reputation of someone whose words require editing before they can be trusted, whose presence in a room generates activity rather than clarity, whose contributions are frequent enough to be abundant and abundant enough to be, in the precise psychological sense of the word, cheap. And cheapness, in the economy of professional reputation, is the one quality that is almost impossible to unlearn once it has been assigned. Scarcity is what creates value, in commodities, in attention. In the words of a person whose silence has taught every room they have ever sat in that when they finally choose to speak, it is worth stopping to hear. Margaret understood this not as a strategy, but as a temperament, a natural expression of who she genuinely was. But temperament, as it turns out, can be cultivated, not manufactured, not performed, but grown from the inside out through the patient, repeated identity-level practice that the previous sections of this journey have been building toward. What remains is not another concept to absorb or another framework to apply. What remains is the fullest expression of everything that strategic silence, practiced across a career and embodied in a life, eventually becomes. Not a way of communicating, a way of leading. And the leaders who have walked this path longest, who have spent decades refining their relationship with silence until it is no longer a discipline, but simply the way they exist in professional space, carry with them something that titles cannot confer and credentials cannot replicate, and volume, no matter how sustained or impressive, has never once produced. They carry the weight of words that are believed before they are finished. And what those words say, and what they choose forever not to say, is the final and most enduring chapter of everything this journey has been moving toward. There is a meeting that happens at some point in the arc of every significant career that is different from all the others, not in its format, not in its agenda or its attendees or the stakes being discussed, different in a quality that is harder to name than any of those things, a quality of weight, of consequence, of the particular atmosphere that settles over a room when the people in it understand, without anyone having said so directly, that what is decided here will matter for a long time. In that room, a specific dynamic plays out with the reliability of a natural law. The people who speak most are the people being evaluated. The people who speak last are the people doing the evaluating. And the person whose single contribution, offered quietly after everyone else is finished, in the particular tone of someone who has been listening with genuine attention for the full duration of the conversation, reorients the entire room around a clarity that was not there before. That person does not need to announce their authority. They do not need to position or qualify or frame. They simply speak, and the room knows. This is not a romantic notion about the wisdom of silence. It is an observable, repeatable phenomenon that plays out in organizations of every size, in industries of every kind, in cultures across every geography where human beings gather in rooms to make decisions together. The person who speaks last, who has absorbed everything that came before and distilled it into something more true than any individual contribution could have reached alone, is the person who shapes what the room decides. And shaping what rooms decide is, in the most practical and consequential sense, what leadership actually is. Not managing, not directing, not even inspiring in the motivational sense that word is sometimes used. Shaping, the quiet, patient, almost invisible work of bringing collective thinking toward clarity. Not by imposing a conclusion, but by creating the conditions in which the right conclusion becomes, to everyone present, suddenly and obviously apparent. The most effective leaders do not win arguments. They make arguments unnecessary. Consider what this looks like across the full arc of a career. In the early years, a professional builds credibility through contribution, through the visible, demonstrable, output-oriented work that establishes their competence in the eyes of the people who make decisions about where talent gets invested. This is necessary work. It is honest work. And it requires a kind of energy and visibility that is entirely appropriate to the season. But something begins to shift in the middle years of a career that the most effective professionals learn to navigate, and the least effective ones spend the rest of their careers fighting against. The nature of the value they are expected to provide begins to change. The room stops asking what they can produce and starts asking what they can see, stops evaluating their output and starts evaluating their judgment, stops rewarding their contributions, and starts watching, with a patience and a precision that many rising professionals never fully register, how they occupy a room when the pressure is highest and the outcome is least certain. In those moments, in the rooms where the pressure is real and the uncertainty is genuine and every reactive, anxious, volume-oriented instinct is screaming to be heard, the most effective leaders do something that looks, from the outside, almost passive. They wait. They wait not because they have nothing to say. They wait because they understand something about those rooms that most of the other people in them have not yet learned. They understand that the first thoughts spoken aloud in a high-pressure situation are almost never the most useful ones, that the room needs to empty itself of its reflexive responses before the actual question can be heard clearly, that the most valuable contribution they can make is not to the noise, but to what comes after the noise. There is a man named Robert, chief executive of a mid-sized engineering firm in Ohio, known by his board, his leadership team, and the clients who had worked with him across 2 decades for a quality that they all described independently and in different language as the same thing. He always seemed to know what actually mattered. Not what seemed to matter, not what was loudest or most urgent or most visibly demanding of attention. What actually mattered. The real question beneath the presenting question. The genuine constraint beneath the stated one. The actual decision beneath the one everyone in the room believed they were making. Robert had not always possessed this quality. He had developed it over years of deliberate practice through a discipline that he described to a young executive he was mentoring with a simplicity that initially frustrated her with its apparent insufficiency. He told her that he had trained himself in every important meeting to ask one question before speaking. Not a strategic question, not a question about positioning or framing or impact. A single, quiet, orienting question that he put to himself in the space between the last person finishing and his own mouth opening. The question was, what does this room actually need right now? Not what do I have to offer? Not what will make me appear most valuable? Not even what do I think is true? What does this room actually need right now? Sometimes the answer was a reframe. Sometimes it was a question directed back at the group. Sometimes it was a piece of information that had not yet been surfaced. And sometimes, more often than most people would expect, and far more often than Robert himself had anticipated when he first began practicing this, the answer was nothing. The room needed nothing from him right now, and in those moments, Robert gave the room exactly what it needed. He was quiet, fully, comfortably, undefensively quiet. And the room, encountering that quality of settled, unhurried silence in a person whose judgment they had learned to trust, did something that rooms almost never do when everyone in them is speaking. It thought more clearly. This is the final and most complete expression of the strategic pause. Not a technique for managing impressions, not a negotiating tool for extracting value, not a discipline for building a more compelling communication style. Those things are real, and they matter, and the journey that brought you here has covered each of them with the seriousness they deserve. But beneath all of them, running through all of them like a current through a wire, is something more fundamental than any of them individually. A philosophy of professional presence that rests on a single, quiet, radical premise. The most valuable thing you can offer any room is not your voice. It is your clarity. And clarity does not come from speaking. It comes from the quality of attention that precedes speaking. From the patient, practiced, identity-level commitment to being present enough, still enough, secure enough in your own judgment, that when you finally open your mouth, what comes out has been refined by everything you heard and everything you held and everything you chose, with full awareness, not to say. The leaders who are remembered, not for a quarter, not for a fiscal year, but across the long arc of the careers and organizations and lives they touched, are not remembered for their most eloquent speeches or their most impressive presentations or their most persuasive arguments. They are remembered for something quieter than any of those things. They are remembered for the moments when they were still while everyone else was spinning, for the questions they asked that no one else had thought to ask, for the silences they held that gave other people room to arrive at something true, for the words they finally spoke when they spoke, that cut through everything and landed with the particular weight of something that had been worth waiting for. They are remembered, in the end, for what they chose not to say, and for the wisdom that lived quietly and powerfully in everything that silence contained. Speaking last is not a strategy for winning rooms. It is what winning rooms eventually looks like when you have spent long enough caring more about clarity than credit, more about truth than timing, more about what the room needs than what your anxiety is asking you to provide. It is not something you decide to do one morning and execute that afternoon. It is something you become, slowly and honestly and without performance, through the long, patient, compounding work of learning, in room after room, conversation after conversation, silence after silence, what your presence is actually for. And when you know that, when you have sat with that question long enough and honestly enough that the answer has stopped being an idea and started being something you simply are, you will find that you need far fewer words than you ever thought you did. And the words you do use will carry, in every room you enter for the rest of your career, the quiet and unmistakable weight of everything you understood well enough not to say. There is something that happens when a long journey ends well. Not a fanfare, not a dramatic resolution, something quieter than either of those, a settling. The particular quality of stillness that arrives when you have traveled a significant distance and arrived somewhere that feels, despite being new, strangely like a place you always knew existed. You began this journey with a question that most people spend entire careers circling without ever asking directly. Why do the people who speak least so often earn the most? Not just in the financial sense, though that pattern is real and documented and worth taking seriously, but in the broader, deeper, more enduring sense of earning. Earning trust, earning influence, earning the particular kind of authority that does not depend on a title to function or a room's permission to operate. What you have discovered across these 10 chapters is not a set of techniques. Techniques can be learned on a Tuesday and forgotten by Thursday. What you have encountered here is something more structural than that, a different way of understanding what professional presence actually is, and where it actually comes from, and what it is actually made of.